So we are beginning our series, probably a 10-part series on the book of Exodus. What I want to do tonight, I actually love these first evenings when we're starting a new book in the Bible. I sort of usually call them orientation evenings. And we're going to do three things tonight. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you a broad outline of the book of Exodus, a guided tour through its contents, okay? The second thing I'll do is identify the theme of the book. What is it that holds the whole book together? And then thirdly, and it's where we'll spend most of our time actually interacting with the text, is provide a little taster for how the book of Exodus presents God to us. What do we see of God in the book of Exodus? Because that's the point of the Scriptures. The Scriptures are to give us an insight into who God is, His character and His ways. So that's what we'll be doing tonight. So we begin then by thinking about an outline of the book. Now, if you've been reading it, you'll know already that the book of Exodus is a fairly long book. It consists of 40 chapters, and that in itself is a fair chunk of Holy Scripture. And if you do read the book of Exodus, one of the things that you're going to notice very quickly is how the book is a mix of some chapters of real flowing narrative and sometimes real high-octane narrative. You know, it's the stuff of children's Bibles, isn't it? You know, the story of the Red Sea and the plagues and all that. You know, there's chapters of flowing narrative, but then there's these other chapters of what can feel like very long and perhaps dry chapters where you have lists of laws and commandments, or you have chapters giving instructions, very detailed instructions for the building of the tabernacle and the institution of the priesthood. And it can feel like two very different reads, so they can. So how do you negotiate your way around the book of Exodus? Well, there's a variety of approaches you can take, but one approach that I find really useful is to consider Israel's location as you read through the book. Because the first 15 chapters, basically, Israel is in Egypt. It's in slavery in Egypt. I would suggest to you that those are the chapters that we are probably most familiar with. And you can, I'm going to be very broad brushstroke now, but you could divide up those chapters. I'll come back in a minute to that there. But the first couple of chapters really give us, a description of how Israel prospered in Egypt, even in times of slavery and oppression. But then the next big chunk there comes in the call of Moses. It runs over about 5 chapters. And you have this amazing dialogue that goes on between Moses and God as God calls him to be the deliverer. And we'll be spending a night on that and listening in to Moses' objections. Then, of course, it's the stuff of children's Bibles, big time. We have the actual plagues coming on Egypt. And then, we have the story of the Passover itself. The destroyer coming, but the children of Israel protected behind the blood of the Lamb. Then comes the great deliverance at the Red Sea with Pharaoh's forces coming to reclaim the Israelites. And of course, they go through the sea on dry ground. And then that particular section of the book ends with the marvelous song of deliverance of Moses and Miriam in chapter 15. Now, the emphasis in this first part of the book, by the way, there's a handout for tonight. You'll be getting this in case you're furiously writing that down. The emphasis in this part of the book is very much on Israel's God as their deliverer, their savior, their rescuer. So Israel is physically in Egypt in that early part of the book. But then we come to a few interesting chapters where Israel is in the wilderness. They're now out of Egypt. And it's in these chapters that you get the stories of the manna and the quail, Israel coming upon bitter waters and then being given fresh water from the rock. It's in those chapters that you read about the battle with the Amalekites, with Joshua leading them in the valley and Moses the mediator on the mountain. You encounter places that you've maybe heard of, such as Marah and Elim, the desert of Sin, Marah, Meribah, Rephidim, those places. And the emphasis in those chapters is very much on Israel's God as their companion. The God who delivers them, but who then journeys with his people, providing for them, protecting them, training them. But then, of course, the final and the largest section in the book of Exodus, they're still in the wilderness, but they come to the region of Sinai. In the Sinai desert, they come to Mount Sinai. And in chapter 19, of course, we are given the covenant that God proposes to his redeemed people. The law, the gift of the law. And to be honest, it's those chapters from chapter 19 to the end of the book that are the more challenging read. Because you get all the chapters of laws and commandments, and then it goes into instructions for how the tabernacle is to be built. Then you get a little bit of narrative again, because you have the incident of the golden cow with Aaron, when Moses is up on the mountain, the apostasy and what happens there, and Moses' intercession. But then, just for good measure, you have several more chapters saying how the tabernacle was built. So that's really how the book hangs together. Israel in Egypt, Israel in the wilderness, and Israel at Mount Sinai. There's another little thing that you can do that is just an interesting thing to pursue for yourself. And it's the symbol of fire to indicate the holy presence of God. It's very interesting to watch that develop throughout the book. Because right at the start of the book, with the call of Moses, you have God appearing to Moses in the burning bush. The bush that is alight, but does not burn up. The flame that maintains itself. And what does God say? Moses, don't come any closer, because the ground where you're standing is holy ground, because I'm here. The fire indicates the holy presence of God. And then what happens, of course, when God comes to lead his people out of Israel in the Exodus at Passover, the pillar of fire and cloud goes before them. And when they come to the Red Sea, that pillar of fire moves behind them as a buffer between his people and the Egyptians. And they go through the Red Sea and they come to Sinai. And what happens at Sinai? God comes down on Mount Sinai and it is ablaze with the holy presence of God. And God leads his people. And when we come to the end of Exodus, when the tabernacle is built, what happens? But the fire descends, the pillar of cloud and fire descends upon the tabernacle in the midst of the people. God's holy presence can be tracked through following the fire in the book of Exodus. That's just a little bit about how the book fits together, okay? The second thing I want to deal with is the theme of the book. And I suspect that most people would probably have relatively little difficulty saying what Exodus is all about. I mean, the clue is in the title. Exodus means way out. Interestingly, that name was first given to the book of Exodus when the Greek translation of the Old Testament was being done 2 or 3 centuries before Christ, what we call the Septuagint. They gave it the title Exodus, which in Greek means way out. That's not the title that the Hebrew Bible gives to it. The title that the Hebrew Bible gives to the book of Exodus is, "And these are the names." And you say, what? Or just names? But if you read the opening words of Exodus, it's, "And these are the names of the family of Jacob and Joseph that came out of Egypt." And that's a very important thing because the book of Exodus is taking the story forward. That family grouping of 70, 75 people, whatever it was, that moved into Egypt, it's their story because God made promises to the seed of Abraham. And that's what we're tracking in this book. Now, in respect of the theme, you could ask a crowd of Sunday school kids. That's when we used to have Sunday schools. You could ask a crowd of Sunday school kids, what's the book of Exodus about? And they'll tell you. It's about the children of Israel being set free from their slavery in Egypt. But here's an interesting thing. If freedom is only about being set free from oppression and tyranny and slavery, well then the book of Exodus could have ended at the end of chapter 15. Because by this point, Egypt is firmly in the rearview mirror and Pharaoh is finished. Does the remainder of the book of Exodus have anything to say, anything to add about what it means to be free? And maybe you're thinking, well, of course, just leaving behind Egypt's slavery is not all there is to being free, because God also promised to bring his people into a land, their own land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And that's all very well. But tell me, where is Israel at the end of the book of Exodus? This book of freedom and deliverance. Answer? Israel's still in the desert, still in the wilderness. They have not yet arrived in Canaan, but they're journeying towards it. Exodus invites us to think through what it really means to be free. Israel was not in Egypt, but neither was it in Canaan. But in a very real sense, Israel was free. The people knew that they had been delivered. And they knew that they were heading to their God-given inheritance. Israel was a nation, a people, on the move with God. And with their God-given hope calling them forward while they were in the wilderness. And Israel was a busy nation, a busy people. Don't think that true freedom means sitting around having nothing to do. And there's this wonderful contrast in the book of Exodus. In the early chapters, we see Israel living as slaves, forced to build the royal store cities of Pharaoh. But in the closing chapters of Exodus, Israel isn't sitting around on deck chairs in the desert. They are busy, freely, voluntarily giving themselves to building a tent for God so that He can be with them, so that He can live in their midst. You see, Exodus has a lot to teach us, not just about the path to freedom, which is the first half of the book, but also about the goal of freedom. The second half of the book, what freedom is for. Freedom is not an end in itself. Israel was saved from slavery. But what was Israel saved for? That's what Exodus answers for us. And in actual fact, next week in our first study, we're going to be thinking about the nature of Israel's slavery and what it has to say to us today. And we'll be thinking about the true meaning of freedom, what it means to live in relationship with God. Now, the bit that I really want to focus on for a while here and interact with the text of Exodus. The great question is always, how is God Himself revealed to us in the book of Exodus? And I'm going to mention 7 ways that the book of Exodus allows us to behold God. Here's the first one. How God is revealed in the book of Exodus. He is the God who controls history. Very important in light of our prayer time tonight. He is sovereign. His plans will not be thwarted. Not even by Pharaoh, who you must remember was the world's most powerful leader. Not even Pharaoh can withstand the Lord. Exodus 5 verse 2 is a wonderful verse in the course of what Exodus is about. This is what Pharaoh said when Moses told him in the name of God to release his people so that they might go and worship Him. Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey Him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord and will not let Israel go." The book of Exodus is Pharaoh's education in that. I don't know the Lord, and it's the idea if I don't acknowledge Him, and I certainly ain't going to obey Him. The book of Exodus and the plagues in particular and the judgments are God's revelation of who he is. He is the God who's in control of the whole shebang. Secondly, he is the God who reveals himself. I'll take Pharaoh again. Do you ever ask yourself, why did God persist with Pharaoh? Puny Pharaoh. Why did he put up with him? Well, Exodus actually tells us why. In Exodus 9:16, we read this. This is what God tells Moses to say to Pharaoh. But I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power. Listen. And that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. God wants his name revealed. And that idea, by the way, of God revealing his name is a very major theme in the book of Exodus. We know the story of Moses and the burning bush. Let me read to you Exodus 3, verses 13 to 15. What was that all about? God appearing in a burning bush to Moses. Exodus 3, verse 13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. That is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. He is Yahweh. I am who I am, or it can be translated, I will be who I will be. You've got to remember that to the Hebrew, name is shorthand for character. Moses' task was to reveal God's name to Israel and to Pharaoh. And this he did through the series of events in the book of Exodus. But even towards the end of the book, after Moses has successfully interceded for the nation after the incident of the golden calf, and God has said he will not destroy the nation, Moses still wants more of God. He wants to see more of God. And we read these words in Exodus 33, verse 18 and 19. Then Moses said, now show me your glory. And the Lord said, I will cause all my goodness to pass in front of you, and I will proclaim my name, the Lord, in your presence. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. Go to Exodus 34, verse 6 and 7. Do you see it happening? And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger and abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin, yet he does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children and their children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. By reading Exodus, we learn the Lord's name. We get to see his character, who he is. So he's the God who controls history. He's the God who reveals himself. He is the God who is holy. Where God is, holiness is present. Whether that be, as we've seen, whether that be at the burning bush, Moses, remove your sandals. I'm here. The ground is holy. Or Mount Sinai, with its strict entry requirements and threat to the nation of Israel, to even a cow that would come near it. Or the tabernacle, with its precise rituals and cleansings for the priesthood and for the high priest, who'll get to go into the presence of God one day in the year. You see, God is not just of a different order in that he is the uncreated God, the God who is, the God who has no external source of existence. I am who I am. He's not just of a different order in that way. He is morally perfect. He demands holiness. That's the purpose of the 10 words, the 10 commandments, the law. But not only does he demand holiness, this is wonderful. Exodus shows us he provides holiness. That's what the tabernacle's about. That's what the priesthood and the sacrifices are about. The God who demands holiness provides for it, for his people. The book of Exodus will leave us in no doubt at all that sin is serious because God is holy. His presence brings holiness, requires holiness, and makes provision for holiness. We're going to see that. Fourthly, he is the God who is faithful. Exodus 2, verse 24. Very important verse for understanding as we move into the call of Moses and all that will come. Exodus 2:24. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God remembers his covenant. That doesn't mean he had forgotten about it. The idea of remembering in the Bible, God remembering, it means he calls himself to action. And he's going to be true to his promises. His people can depend on him. And that brings us to what I would suggest are the two great revelations of God in the book of Exodus. So this is number 5. He is the God who acts in salvation. We get our understanding of salvation, of redemption, from the book of Exodus. He saves us out of slavery. He protects us and provides for us and trains us as we make our way through this wilderness. And he's pledged and promised to bring us into the fullness of our inheritance. We are saved from his wrath through the blood of the Lamb. And we are delivered from the power of Pharaoh through crossing the Red Sea. Those two great symbols, by the way, the Passover and crossing the Red Sea, those two great symbols are represented for us today by the Lord's Supper and by baptism. The blood of the Lamb offers us protection from the wrath of God, and through being baptized into Christ, we are brought out of death into new life. And our God, who's a saving God, he puts a new song in his people's hearts. What I want to suggest to you to do before you turn in tonight, I want you to open your Bible at Exodus 15 and to listen to Moses and Miriam lead the people of God in praise because of God's deliverance. It's the most beautiful read, that song, that psalm of salvation. He's the God who acts in salvation. But sixthly, and it's the other side of the coin, folks, he is the God who acts in judgment. The book of Exodus reveals God's unchanging attitude towards sin. If sin is not repented of, and God always gives space for that to happen. And that's revealed so clearly in God's dealings with Pharaoh. But where sin is not repented of, where rebellion persists, God deals with it. The 10 plagues, and finally the overthrow of Pharaoh's chariots at the Red Sea, they reveal God's wrath towards his foes. But God's wrath is never arbitrary. It's not that he has favorites. One of the, God will judge his own servants. One of the most strangest verses in all of the Bible comes in Exodus 4:24. This is referring to Moses. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord has just called Moses to be deliverer. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife. Funny, Denise sent me a text today saying, Geoff, I've got up to Exodus 7. I'm really interested to know. There was one thing. You see, later on in the book of Exodus, God's judgment comes in measure upon his own people. After the incident of the golden calf, even after Moses has successfully interceded that the nation is not wiped out, but 3,000 are killed by the Levites. Exodus 32, verse 28, and a plague follows that. Exodus 32, verse 35. You see, we must preserve the balance. God delights in mercy. Exodus 34, verse 6. His wrath can be turned aside. Exodus 32, verse 30 to 34. God provides the sin offering for his people so that atonement can be made. But, God is a God of judgment who is implacably opposed to sin, and he will deal with sin. How we need to hear the message of the book of Exodus. God has never, ever gone soft on sin. And he never will. Because in his holy nature, he is eternally opposed to it. Seventh and finally, He is the God who lives among his people. The marvelous message of the book of Exodus is that this transcendent Lord, the uncreated Creator, the sovereign Lord, the perfectly holy one, who is completely other, he wants to come and live in the midst of his people. Moses understood that the whole distinctiveness of Israel lay in one thing: the accompanying presence of God with them. What was the whole point of the tabernacle? Exodus 25, verse 8. Let them make a sanctuary for me, and I will dwell among them. And with this I'll finish. Are you familiar with the famous exchange that took place between Moses and the Lord after Moses had prayed that Israel would not be wiped off the face of the earth? Moses interceded and said, Lord, think of your name. Think of your reputation. And God, who was both behind the intercessions, then listens to the intercessions and says, okay, I won't destroy them. And you know what? Exodus 33, listen to this. This is precious. Exodus 33, verse 14. The Lord replied, my presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. We're back on track, Moses. I'm going to go with you. I'm going to lead you. I'm going to take you into the promised land. Then Moses said to him, if your presence does not go with us, don't send us up from here. Moses understood that the unique thing about the people of God is this: their God is with them. He travels with them. This utterly just indescribable God, he's with us. That's what the book of Exodus shows us. The most amazing truth to get hold of. Here's our future studies. Slavery, then and now. Moses, the man of God. Confronting Pharaoh. Israel's salvation. Lessons from food and drink. Victory in the valley. The goal of redemption. The great apostasy. And the renewal of the covenant. So that's where we're going to be going. I just say to you, read the book of Exodus. Just keep reading it. For next week specifically, read up to about chapter 5 in a wee bit more detail. We're going to be thinking about slavery. Slavery is still a reality in our world. And I ain't talking about bonded labour and all that exploitation. That's there. But there's a deeper, more serious form of slavery again. That's what we're going to be thinking about.